Welcome to our exploration of gender and environmental change in the developing world. In this video, we'll dive into how gender roles and relations intersect with climate change, disaster risk, and sustainable development. We'll look at the evolution of gender-focused policies, the challenges of mainstreaming gender in environmental agendas, and the real-world impacts on women and communities. By understanding these connections, we can better appreciate why inclusive, evidence-based policies are essential for both gender equality and environmental sustainability. Let's begin by tracing the roots of gender and development thinking and how it shapes current debates. Field of gender and development emerged in the 1970s, initially focusing on integrating women into development processes. Early approaches like Women in Development (WID) aimed to address practical needs such as education and water access. However, critics argued that WID overlooked the deeper structures of gender inequality. This led to the Gender and Development GAD approach, which examines the roles and relations that exclude women from development and seeks to address strategic interests, like land rights and freedom from violence. These foundational debates continue to influence how gender is considered in environmental and climate change policies today. The 1980s, ecofeminist ideas linked women closely to nature, often based on traditional roles and the sexual division of labor. While this perspective highlighted women's environmental contributions, it was critiqued for essentializing women and reinforcing stereotypes. Newer approaches like feminist political ecology emphasize that gender-environment relations are shaped by dynamic social and political factors, not just biology. This shift recognizes women's agency and the complexity of gender identities, moving beyond simplistic victim or caretaker roles. These evolving theories set the stage for more nuanced policy and research on gender and environmental change. Today, climate change dominates discussions of global environmental change. Despite a rich literature on gender and the environment, gender has often been a latecomer to climate policy debates. The focus on scientific and technological solutions has sometimes sidelined social dimensions, including gender. However, a growing body of research and advocacy is pushing for gender-sensitive climate policies. Collections and studies now highlight the unique ways climate change affects women and the importance of including their voices in adaptation and mitigation strategies. Still, significant gaps remain between research, policy, and practice. Relationship between climate change and disasters is complex. While many disasters are linked to extreme weather, disaster risk reduction (DRR) and climate change adaptation (CCA) often operate in separate policy silos. Gender research in disasters began gaining traction in the 1980s and 1990s, highlighting how women's experiences and vulnerabilities are shaped by social roles and inequalities. Despite progress, gender is still not fully mainstreamed in disaster response and recovery, and women's needs and capacities are frequently overlooked in both research and field practice. International frameworks like CEDAW and the Beijing Platform for Action have set important precedents for including gender in global policy. CEDAW affirms women's rights and calls for equal decision-making, but lacks enforcement power. The Beijing Platform highlights women's role in environmental decision-making, yet disasters and broader environmental issues are often treated as secondary. While these frameworks have advanced gender inclusion, their practical impact on climate and disaster policy has been limited, with many countries slow to fully implement gender-sensitive measures. 1992 Rio Earth Summit and the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, were milestones in global environmental governance. Women's groups advocated for gender inclusion, and Agenda 21 recognized women as key actors in environmental protection. However, the UNFCCC itself was largely gender-blind, and subsequent climate negotiations have struggled to move beyond token references to gender. Progress has been made through advocacy and the formation of networks, but gender remains an afterthought in many climate policies. Hyogo Framework for Action (HFA), established in 2005, aimed to reduce disaster losses and integrate risk reduction into development. It called for gender perspectives in disaster management, but in practice, gender was only mentioned a few times in the document. Despite explicit references, gender integration in DRR has been limited, and women's roles in risk reduction and adaptation are still not fully recognized. The ongoing negotiations for the next framework highlight the need to move beyond viewing women solely as vulnerable victims. Millennium Development Goals (MDGs) included standalone goals for gender equality and environmental sustainability. However, the gender goal focused mainly on education, political participation, and employment, reflecting a WID approach. The environmental goal addressed symptoms rather than root causes, and disasters were not explicitly included. Critics argue that the MDGs failed to tackle structural inequalities, including gender, that underlie environmental degradation and vulnerability to disasters. As the MDGs ended, the United Nations began developing the Sustainable Development Goals (SDGs), aiming for a more integrated approach to poverty, environment, and gender. The SDGs proposed disaggregating indicators by gender and including standalone goals for both gender and climate change. However, disasters are still treated as enablers rather than core development challenges, and gender mainstreaming in climate and environment remains limited. The SDGs represent progress, but much work remains to ensure gender is central in sustainable development. Climate change debates are often framed as scientific and gender-neutral, privileging expert knowledge over local perspectives. However, studies show that men and women experience and interpret climate impacts differently. For example, women may focus on family health while men emphasize agricultural production. Including women's voices is crucial for a complete understanding of climate impacts and for designing effective adaptation strategies. Bridging expert and local knowledge can lead to more inclusive and responsive policies. Policy literature often assumes that women are more vulnerable to climate change due to fewer resources and limited access to education and income. While it's true that poverty and inequality increase vulnerability, policies rarely build on the specific knowledge and capacities of women. Instead, they tend to reinforce stereotypes of women as victims or caretakers. Effective adaptation requires recognizing and supporting the diverse roles and strengths of both women and men in responding to climate challenges. Adaptation to climate change can reshape gender roles, sometimes offering opportunities for empowerment. Women may take on new responsibilities, access finance, or move into non-traditional employment. However, these changes can also bring new burdens or reinforce inequalities. For example, adaptation strategies like biofuel production may threaten women's livelihoods or increase their workload. It's important to examine how adaptation affects gender relations and ensure that policies promote equitable outcomes. While much research focuses on rural areas, cities are increasingly important for sustainable development. Over half the world's population now lives in urban areas, and women's roles in urban planning, mobility, and consumption are gaining attention. Studies highlight the need for gender-sensitive urban planning that considers women's safety, unpaid care work, and participation in grassroots movements. Strengthening local governments and community assets can support more inclusive and resilient cities. Green economy promises sustainable growth, but its gender implications are complex. Market-based approaches can sometimes lead to land and resource grabs, benefiting corporations over local communities. Women's needs and voices are often overlooked in green policies, and definitions of green can be vague or problematic. Advocates call for a shift toward equitable, solidarity-based economies that value unpaid care work and prioritize sufficiency over efficiency. Gender budgeting and inclusive governance are tools that can help steer green growth in a more just direction. Disaster management has traditionally relied on scientific and technical solutions, often sidelining social and gender dimensions. Disasters are frequently viewed as uncontrollable natural events requiring technical fixes, rather than as social phenomena shaped by vulnerability and inequality. Gender research in disasters has challenged this perspective, highlighting the need for intersectional approaches that consider how gender, class, and other factors influence risk and recovery. Recent decades have seen a shift from focusing solely on women's vulnerabilities in disasters to considering gender equality and intersectionality. Conferences and networks have promoted the inclusion of both women and men in disaster risk reduction. However, policy and practice still often rely on essentialized views of women as victims or caretakers, rather than recognizing their diverse experiences and capacities. True gender mainstreaming requires moving beyond stereotypes and engaging with the realities of all affected groups. Despite advances, significant gaps remain in our understanding of gender disaster impacts. Data on deaths, injuries, and losses are rarely disaggregated by gender, making it difficult to assess true vulnerabilities and needs. Where data exist, they often show higher female mortality in disasters, especially where women's socioeconomic status is low. Understanding these patterns requires better data collection and a focus on the underlying power relations that shape vulnerability. Men and women often perceive and respond to disaster risks differently. Studies suggest that women are more likely to act on early warnings, while men may underestimate risks or take greater physical risks during disasters. These differences are shaped by social roles, access to information, and cultural expectations. Recognizing and addressing these variations can improve disaster preparedness and response for everyone. Men play crucial roles in disaster recovery, often leading community efforts and supporting families. However, their contributions are frequently undervalued or framed as extensions of their traditional roles. Reconstruction projects may target women as beneficiaries, but often focus on practical needs rather than addressing deeper inequalities. Ensuring that women's leadership and strategic interests are recognized is key to building more resilient communities. Disasters can have double impacts on women and girls, including increased workloads, loss of education, deteriorating health, and heightened risk of violence. Relief and reconstruction efforts may inadvertently reinforce gender inequalities or create new burdens. For example, girls may be expected to juggle school, household, and community roles, while women face increased demands on their time and energy. Addressing these secondary impacts requires gender-sensitive planning and support. Post-disaster environments often see increases in violence against women, including sexual violence and trafficking. Loss of status, dignity, and security can have long-lasting effects on women's well-being. Aid and reconstruction initiatives may unintentionally contribute to these problems if they fail to consider power dynamics and the specific needs of women and girls. Empowering women and addressing violence must be central to disaster response. While disasters can disrupt traditional gender roles and create opportunities for change, these windows of opportunity are not guaranteed or equally accessible to all women. Some may find new employment or leadership roles, while others face increased barriers due to lack of education or resources. Positive changes in gender relations are possible, but require intentional support and recognition of diverse experiences. Research highlights the potential for post-traumatic growth after disasters, where individuals and communities develop greater resilience, compassion, and appreciation for life. Women may adopt new identities or take on leadership roles, but these changes are often accompanied by new challenges. Recognizing and supporting positive transformations can help build stronger, more equitable communities in the aftermath of crisis. Resilience has become a key concept in disaster and development policy, emphasizing the capacity to adapt and recover from shocks. However, the meaning of resilience is still debated, and it may not always align with poverty reduction or gender equality. Building resilience requires addressing underlying inequalities and ensuring that policies are inclusive and responsive to the needs of all community members, especially women and marginalized groups. Across the literature on gender, climate change, and disasters, several common themes emerge. These include the production of knowledge, the potential for crisis to drive change, the challenges of inclusion, the importance of social reproduction, and the risks of mainstreaming gender or environment without addressing power dynamics. Understanding these themes helps us see the connections and gaps between research, policy, and practice. Feminist scholars have long critiqued the idea of objective scientific knowledge, arguing that all knowledge is situated and shaped by social context. In both climate change and disaster research, scientific methods often dominate, sidelining qualitative and local perspectives. Recognizing the value of diverse forms of knowledge, including women's experiences, is essential for developing more effective and inclusive policies. Both climate change and disaster literature suggest that crises can open windows of opportunity for changing gender roles. However, evidence for lasting positive change is mixed. While women may take on new responsibilities during crises, these shifts do not always translate into long-term improvements in gender relations. Policymakers must be cautious in assuming that crisis alone will drive progress toward equality. Including gender in policy agendas is a key goal for activists, but how inclusion happens matters. Too often, women are targeted as efficient agents of poverty reduction or disaster response, reinforcing traditional roles rather than challenging inequalities. True inclusion requires addressing the root causes of gender inequality and ensuring that women are served by policies not just used to deliver them. Women's unpaid care and reproductive work is central to both development and environmental debates. While these roles are often valued for their efficiency, they are rarely rewarded or recognized. Policies that focus on women as mothers or caretakers can reinforce burdens without addressing underlying inequalities. Shift toward valuing and supporting unpaid care work is needed, but must avoid reinforcing stereotypes or limiting women's choices. Additional cash transfer (CCT) programs are popular policy tools that provide resources to women in exchange for meeting health or education targets. While they can support families, they may also reinforce traditional gender roles and increase women's responsibilities without empowering them. Evidence shows that CCTs can define women primarily as mothers, rather than as individuals with diverse needs and aspirations. Focus on women as mothers and caretakers is not new. In both environmental and disaster literature, women are often cast as virtuous victims or efficient service providers. This motherization can increase workloads and expectations without improving women's status or power. It's important to recognize and challenge these narratives, ensuring that women's rights and choices are at the center of policy. Mainstreaming gender and environment into development policy has become a common goal, but the process is fraught with challenges. Too often, mainstreaming becomes a technical exercise, diluting the focus on power and inequality. Gender and environment are treated as cross-cutting issues, but responsibility for real change is unclear. Effective mainstreaming requires political commitment and a willingness to address structural barriers. Just as mainstreaming gender can become a box-ticking exercise, greening the economy can serve as greenwashing, giving the appearance of progress without real change. If women are expected to deliver sustainable consumption and social protection without addressing underlying inequalities, greening may reinforce rather than challenge gender disparities. Genuine progress requires integrating gender and environment at the core of policy and practice. Social protection programs, including CCTs, are increasingly seen as solutions for both development and disaster response. While they can support adaptation and resilience, they must be designed with gender in mind to avoid reinforcing traditional roles or creating new burdens. Linking social protection with gender equality and empowerment is key to building more inclusive and effective systems. Adolescent girls are gaining attention in both disaster and climate change policy, often seen as a group needing special support. While education and empowerment are important, it's crucial to recognize the diverse realities of girls' lives and avoid imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. Policies must respect girls' agency and address the intersecting challenges they face. Intersectionality, the recognition that gender interacts with other identities like class, ethnicity, and age, is increasingly important in research and policy. Understanding how multiple forms of inequality shape vulnerability and resilience can lead to more effective and just interventions. Intersectional approaches move beyond simple categories and address the complexity of real-world experiences. Major barrier to effective gender and environment policy is the lack of disaggregated data. Without information on how men and women are affected by disasters and climate change, policies risk being based on assumptions rather than evidence. Improving data collection and analysis is essential for designing targeted, effective interventions that address real needs. Feminist economists and scientists have shown the importance of engaging with scientific methods to challenge gender-blind evidence. By participating in research and policy debates, gender advocates can ensure that women's experiences and perspectives are included in the evidence base. This engagement is crucial for shifting policy from stereotypes to informed, inclusive action. While much policy is based on macro-level data, micro-level studies, especially at the household level, are essential for understanding how environmental change affects men and women differently. These studies reveal the nuances of daily life decision-making and adaptation, providing a richer foundation for policy and practice. Supporting more localized research can help bridge the gap between evidence and action. Climate change and disaster research often operate in separate silos, but their impacts and solutions are deeply interconnected. Studies that consider both short and long-term risks and that integrate gender analysis are needed to address the complex challenges facing communities. Bridging these fields can lead to more holistic and effective policies. A women's resilience and resourcefulness are often celebrated in policy and literature. It's important to recognize that inclusion in policy initiatives can be as problematic as exclusion. Without addressing underlying inequalities, policies may increase women's burdens or reinforce traditional roles. True progress requires structural change and a commitment to gender justice. Improve the position and situation of women in the face of environmental change, policies must be inclusive and evidence-based. This means collecting better data, engaging with diverse forms of knowledge, and addressing the root causes of inequality. Only by moving beyond stereotypes and assumptions can we create policies that truly serve women and support sustainable development. Summary: gender and environmental change are deeply intertwined, with policies and practices shaped by evolving theories, persistent gaps, and ongoing debates. Progress has been made, but challenges remain in mainstreaming gender, collecting data, and designing inclusive policies. By learning from past experiences and embracing intersectional evidence-based approaches, we can build a more just and sustainable future for all. As we look to the future, it's clear that addressing gender and environmental change requires ongoing commitment, collaboration, and innovation. Policymakers, researchers, and communities must work together to close knowledge gaps, challenge stereotypes, and promote equality. By centering women's voices and experiences, we can ensure that environmental policies are not only effective but also just and inclusive. Thank you for joining us on this journey.